Hey, Comcovers. So we are doing our second frame on society. So our topic today, under the big theme of society, is civil society and social movements. So let's start. This is in the AP Comparative Government curriculum. This is 3.1 and I believe 3.2. So, civil society, the definition, and this is according to the College Board, comprises a range of voluntary associations that are autonomous from the state. So these are just basically voluntary groups, organizations that are separate from government, including these organizations can include local religious and neighborhood organizations, news media, business, and professional associations. There are things like labor unions and, Christian organizations like YMCA. And these are all referred to as non governmental organizations or NGOs. So, some characteristics of civil society. So, the strength and variety of civil society organizations differ depending on the type of government that it exists under or the type of regime that they operate under. So, if the government is authoritarian and oppressive, then civil society organizations can be limited, right? And so they don't have as much of an impact on society. So if you've got a human rights organization, which is an NGO operating in, say, China, well, that organization is not going to have a lot of impact because of strict government regulations. Though civil society organizations are not necessarily political, a robust civil society serves as an agent of democracy or an agent of democratization. So the more free and more uh, unrestricted civil society is allowed to have, the greater amount of democratization, because it serves essentially as a check on government. It can be a political check on government, but it can also be a non political check on government. So, for example, if there was government was doing things that maybe suppressed the civil rights of or the civil liberties of I don't know, uh, African Americans, well, the NAACP would rise up and start challenging the government to say, hey, you can't do that. And so, as a result, it could potentially have an effect under a strong civil society. It could have a strong impact on that government, and the government may make certain changes and adjustments based on the pressure and influences of these civil society organizations or NGOs. All right, so across our countries, our 6 countries, civil society organizations vary. Some governments heavily monitor, some expose government malfeasance, which means government corruption. Some represent the interests of distinct members, certain groups of people. For example, you could have an NGO that represents the rights of the LGBTQ population. And it provides members with organizational experience. And it's usually these things are grassroots organizations. So, across our course countries, placing restrictions on NGOs and civil society tends to highlight violations of civil liberties that are usually, even though civil liberties are protected under constitutional documents or other types of foundational documents, the way that the country operates, it may just ignore those constitutional protections. Okay, so NGOs, we said, were national and international groups independent of the government or the state and pursue policy objectives that foster public participation. So they pursue a policy objective, maybe, like I said, human rights, or they want to pursue civil rights, or they want to, it could be something like swim clubs, right? So it could be anything. All right, so let's talk about civil rights and liberties. And one of the big things associated with this is transparency. So, government is transparent when it allows information about government and policy making to circulate openly, usually through some sort of media. Authoritarian regimes tend to do everything behind closed doors, kind of like in China, where things, even choosing the president, is behind closed doors. Now, uh, competitive authoritarian regimes. So, what is that? That is a hybrid regime, a hybrid between democratic and authoritarian. And a good example of this is Russia. Although technically they're a democracy, in practice they are an authoritarian regime. And another term for a competitive authoritarian regime is illiberal democracy. So, what makes them illiberal? Well, they do hold elections, yay, democracy, but they're not free and fair, right? So, holding contested elections, but with limited degrees of competitiveness and providing minimal civil liberty protections and government transparency. So, for example, in Iran, we know that yes, they have elections, but the Shah, the not the Shah, the Ayatollah, can take candidates off the list. So not so free and fair and competitive. Uh, let's see. And then there is a scale. How authoritarian, how democratic are you? And that just based on how a government responds to whether they protect the civil rights and civil liberties of their population. Okay, so let's begin our discussion of our six countries and their civil society. So in the UK, it's healthy, it's independent, it's unrestricted in its formation, and there are over 900,000 organizations that are considered to be NGOs. The Confederation of British Industries, the Trade Union Congress, and a lot of these very powerful organizations tend to focus on labor, business, and government. But of course, there is tons of others. Um, so another type of NGO is a Quango, and this is very specific to the UK. It's a quasi autonomous, non governmental organization. And what does it do? It serves as an NGO on a specific policy. Like, for example, there's a Quango on the Forestry Commission in the UK. But it is quasi autonomous because the boards are appointed by the government tax supported, but not controlled by central government and develop policy. And they are in charge of developing policy. I think the idea is that we don't want bureaucrats or elected officials to make policy on, say, nuclear um, enrichment, right? Because no one, only nuclear physicists understand that. So a Quango is set up, and the government hires basically experts in that field. So, under a strong democracy, Quangos work well. Under maybe authoritarian regimes, maybe they don't work so well. Okay, moving on. So, Russia. So Russia's civil society is weak and restricted. Meaning Putin, has placed restrictions on NGOs and various other interest groups, such as, you may recall, the Russian Foreign Agent Law. This required all NGOs that receive any kind of foreign donation to register with the government so that the government can now keep a watch on you. Then in 2015, the Undesirable Organization Act, and this basically said that any non governmental organization or NGO that it deems as undesirable is now banned, right? Because they now are seen as a national security threat. So there is great limitations on NGOs. An NGO that does exist that is very popular is Nashi. This is the Russian youth you could call it Russian youth organization that is very pro Putin, as you can see here by the Putin t shirts, very patriotic. But civil society is also very limited. Let's talk about some infringements upon civil rights and civil liberties. For example, Pussy Riot. This was a punk rock band that protested Putin's oppression by doing a performance at a Russian Orthodox church. The members of the band were arrested and served prison time for basically being in opposition to Putin. Then in 2017, 2018, there was the Open Russia movement. And this was founded by former oligarch Mikhail Khodorkovsky, whose organization promotes civil society and democracy. So this organization is for, but he has to operate out of London because it's not allowed to exist in Russia. Then we have some activists who have been repressed. Their civil rights and civil liberties. Vladimir Karamuza, that's him right here. He is a political activist and journalist who's been poisoned twice by the Russians in 2015 and 2017 that left him in a coma because um, he didn't say great things about the Russian government or Putin. So that's here, Vladimir Karamuza. Then we have Boris Nemtsov. Boris Nemtsov, shown right here. He was actually an opposition leader to Putin. Like, he led a political party who was in opposition to Putin, and he was shot just a few hundred yards from the Kremlin by the Russian government in 2015. And then this guy here on the back, the corner, him, he's still alive. His Alexei Navalny. Navalny is another opposition leader who is still alive, but he is routinely arrested and charged with corruption so that he can't run in elections. So we do see infringements upon civil liberties and civil rights, and therefore there is very much a weak and restricted civil society. Oh, yeah. Okay, let's go to China. So China's civil society is also weak, and it's also monitored. NGOs are also monitored by the state. So NGOs and interest groups must register with the government. Some NGOs have been banned, like the Falun Gong. This organization is actually a modern Chinese spiritual practice that combines meditation and exercise along with a very Zen philosophy centered on truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance. But starting in 1999, they've been persecuted. You can kind of see them up here in the upper right hand corner. So, yes, that's an example of how civil society is restricted. NGOs are restricted. So they are all NGOs are closely watched by the government, especially religious and human rights NGOs. Now, one thing that the Communist Party has done in order to kind of gain control over the NGOs is to make them affiliated with the Communist Party. It's called mass organization. So the party essentially creates all these organizations within the Communist Party so that people then feel like they can express their points of view. But because this is run by the Communist Party, these interest groups exist to strengthen the power of the Communist Party and serves as channels for the Communist Party. So an example of NGOs under the CCP umbrella is the All China Federation of Trade Unions, which is kind of like a labor union, the All China Women's Federation, which is basically women's rights movement, but again, because they are monitored by the government, right, and their relationship is with the government, they are corporatist, which is what that means, and these are organizations that government goes to in order to create policy. Since this is all under the CCP, it's heavily controlled. There are protests against the civil rights and civil liberties of the Chinese. Riots in Tibet. We've discussed yesterday the Tibetan riots due to the oppression of Buddhism. Tiananmen Square. This was, as you all remember, a call for more democratic reforms, but was crushed by tanks. Then we had the current Hong Kong protests for greater autonomy and independence because Hong Kong, that has such a long history of westernization, doesn't like the oppressive and restrictive nature of of the Chinese government. Then we have the Taiwan protests as the Republic of China. That's what they consider themselves. And they want their independence from the PRC, the People's Republic of China. Then, of course, the violation of the civil rights of the Uyghurs in the Zhejiang province of China by imprisoning them in what the Chinese call re-education camps. And the government has reportedly detained more than 1 million Muslims, Uyghurs, in the Xinjiang province. You can see some of the prisons right here. All right, moving on, let's go to Mexico. So Mexico, like we said before, is in transition. So they are transitioning from corporatism to pluralism. Reminder, corporatism is when government picks the NGO to help them develop policy. Pluralism is where various NGOs are competing for the ear of government. And so Mexico continues to strengthen its NGOs as it continues to democratize. What makes Mexico kind of interesting is that it has a history of lively civil society that has encouraged this going transition to democratization. An example of this growing democratization is the PAN victory of Vicente Fox in 2000 presidential election, in which the PRI, the long-standing dominant political party, lost for the first time in 2000. The PRI's downfall started in civil society, where discontented businessmen who were not incorporated into the government system and opposed to all this government expansion within the economy, they created an organization, a political organization known as the PAN. And this was way back in 1939. And although the PAN did not have any major success until 2000, again, civil society was being cultivated, and it eventually led to more democratization. Let's see. So, despite the dominance of the PRI, Mexico has always had a surprising number of groups who refuse to cooperate. Another example of this is going to be the 1985 Mexico City earthquake. Remember that when the earthquake that devastated Mexico City, government was very slow to respond, and it didn't respond to the level that the people felt was legitimate. So various NGOs started popping up to deal with this crisis. And another NGO that became political was the PRD. The PRD, now a political party, grew and challenged the PRI. And again, they were one of the first that started to oust the PRI or PRI in local elections. So there is an increasing number of NGOs, feminist organizations, student groups. In 1994, there was 2,500 organizations, but by 2008, there were at over 10,000. So again, democratization is being increased, and so does the civil society. And here's some examples of civil society, some NGOs rather. All right, let's now move to Nigeria. So Nigeria, I guess you could say it has civil society. It has it. And it is allowed to be free in its operation. But the biggest problem with Nigeria is that their culture is so used to corruption, poverty, and a lack of education. Not a lot of people participate in these non-governmental organizations. It's not widespread. So it's pluralist, meaning that various NGOs do compete for the ear of government, but due to corruption, poverty, and lack of education, it is not very effective. So a lot of groups do make demands on government and political systems, such as MEND. This is the Movement for the Emancipation of the Niger Delta. And MOSOP, the Movement for the Survival of the Ogoni People. This is where activist Ken Saro-Wiwa was very prominent in his opposition to various oil companies operating in the Niger River Delta and polluting it like crazy. You can kind of see that here. Ken Saro-Wiwa was arrested and executed along with 9 other Ogoni by the Nigerian government. So again, corruption, and it's prebendal culture. Prebendalism is that where political figures use their office to gain personal wealth. This is a prebendalism. So all those military authoritarian leaders like Babangida are going to personally benefit from their office, and this is known as prebendalism. So all that corruption, people just become so disillusioned, they just don't feel that their activism is going to make a difference. All right, civil society is free to develop independently. As a matter of fact, their constitution was amended. The Nigerian constitution was amended in 1999, that permitted freedom of assembly, association, and civil society, but most Nigerians do not participate because of poverty and lack of education. There's also, because of corruption, strong patron-client system. That basically means I rub your back, you rub mine. So this is the spoil system or the patronage that exists and is so pervasive throughout Nigerian political history. Some organizations that exist that are relatively strong and popular are religious interest groups. That's because religion is such a big deal in Nigeria. There's both Muslim and Christian organizations. You have the Christian Organization of Nigeria, and the Muslim Civil Society organizations in the north. Alrighty, so let's move on to our final country, and that's Iran. Its civil society is weak, and government laws allow supervision of NGOs. So much like we saw in China and Russia, Iran also has great government supervision and monitoring of NGO activities. Now, Iran has attempted, and there was periods of its time where it attempted to democratize and gain civil society, like during the Tehran Spring. This is where President, not the Ayatollah, President Khatami, the reform president in the early 2000s, did things like opened up more newspapers and opened up more civil society, but that pretty much ended with Ahmadinejad's election. When he became president, he was a hardliner, and so he's going to crack down on newspapers, banned and censored books and websites. So, much like we just saw in Nigeria, the Constitution, the 1979 Constitution, does guarantee freedom of assembly as long as it does not violate Islam or the Islamic Republic. So, limitations there. So some examples of violations. Protest movements like the Green Movement. This was a re-election of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad and the opposition leader Hussein Musavi. And during this election, um, the outcome was a victory again for the incumbent, you know, Ahmadinejad, but there was a huge protest because people thought that the Iranians thought that the 2009 election was rigged. And so one of the largest protests since the 1979 revolution in Iran was the Green Movement. Thousands took to the streets, as you can see here. And thousands of Revolutionary Guards and volunteers, the Bashij, dispersed crowds and violence ensued. Death toll is contested, and basically protesters and supporters of Musavi started the Green Movement after Musavi's campaign color, green. So protests and demonstrations take place, and they take place frequently. And despite government's intolerance against public demonstrations, they do continue, particularly on college campuses. So protests do exist in Iran, and a lot of it is to fight for civil rights and civil liberties, but the government generally just doesn't make any changes as a result of those protests. They just keep it on, keep it on. So as a result, civil society there is weak. All right, so that ends this video. Have a good one. Stay safe.